Welcome to Annunciation Radio's Faith with Reasons, the program that examines what the Church teaches and why. Faith with Reasons.
Well, happy Advent and welcome to Faith with Reasons. Ron Finn here along with Shayne Stanfield in the studio here at Annunciation Radio. How you doing, Shayne?
I'm doing pretty good. How about yourself, Ron?
Good. Are you ready for Christmas?
Oh, no.
Well, that's good because you should still be prepared.
I'm
prepared.
Celebrating Advent, so it gives me every excuse to avoid the stores.
Yeah, that's right. And we get this short Advent, so we want to make every minute count.
That's absolutely correct. And, we were just talking about that last week, just how short this season is. That's right.
We are excited to welcome Father Dwight Longenecker back to the program on a bit ago on another book. But, as we prepare for Christmas, he's got a couple of Christmas books out. Mm-hmm. And, in fact, I understand there's an Advent special on them at his website, dwightlongenecker.com. But we're talking today about a new book called The Secret of the Bethlehem Shepherds from Sophia Institute. And Father Dwight is joining us from wherever he is. I'll have to ask him where he is right now. I don't know. I just called him. So, but he was brought up in evangelical, studied at the fundamental Bob Jones University, and later ordained as an Anglican priest in England. And we heard a lot of that fascinating story last time he was on, a month or two ago. After 10 years in the Anglican ministry as a curate, a chaplain at Cambridge, and a country parson, in 1995, Dwight was received into full communion with the Catholic Church, and he's published in numerous religious magazines and papers in the UK, Ireland, and the USA, writing on film and theology, apologetics, biblical commentary, and Catholic culture. Of course, an accomplished author and speaker as well. And my only question, really, right out of the gate for Father Dwight Longenecker is, you're pretty highfalutin. What are you doing on a chintzy little show like ours?
Don't believe everything you read on the back of book on the back of book covers.
Well, it's great to have you back on with us.
Thank you.
How have you been?
Doing pretty good, thanks. And I'm in Greenville, South Carolina, which is to answer your question.
I think that's where you were last time we spoke with you.
Yeah, I'm the pastor of Our Lady of the Rosary Church in Greenville, South Carolina.
Wonderful.
Very good, very good. And, of course, we're going to be talking about The Secret of the Bethlehem Shepherds, but also Mysteries of the Magi, which is a previous book that is also a very, very apropos for Christmas time reading. You've got some great resources there at your website. So thank you for doing this. And I know you spent some time in the Holy Land on sabbatical. Can you tell us about that? And is that what sprang from that? Are these books, or the current book, a product of that sabbatical?
Yeah, some years ago, I was asked to write an article about the wise men, the Magi who appear in Matthew's Gospel. So I began to do a bit of research, and most of the scholars said, they came from Persia or present-day Iran and Iraq. But when I dug a bit further, the Old Testament prophesied that they would come from Midian, Sheba, and Kedar. And so I thought, well, where are those places in the time of Jesus' birth? And they were actually in Western Arabia. So I began to do a bit more research and found a much more likely origin for the wise men, which is in the kingdom of the Nabateans in Western Arabia. And this matched up with a lot of the other research that I did. So that produced the book, The Mystery of the Magi, which came out in 2017. Mm-hmm. And then I was curious about the shepherds in Luke's Gospel. So in 2022, when I had the opportunity to take a sabbatical, I spent it in Jerusalem and Bethlehem researching the Bethlehem Shepherds, which is the result, and the result of that was this book.
Wonderful. And when you, so just to be clear, you had produced your first book, and once after that was out, then you decided to go and actually spend time there doing further research.
Exactly. Most of the research for the Book of the Wise Men was mostly done through typical research methods of, reading lots and lots of books and talking to some experts and so forth. But for the Bethlehem Shepherds, there wasn't really that much literature about it. So I thought, well, why not go to Bethlehem and actually do a bit of digging on site? So, I spent 2 months in Jerusalem with several visits to Bethlehem, to the actual sites, and visited some present-day Bethlehem Shepherds and some local people there to talk about the history firsthand.
Wonderful.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and that's what I love about particularly your books, but any good reading, because you learn so much, and it makes you hungry to learn even more. So you want to get more deeply entrenched, if you will, and your books consistently do that. They draw the reader in, and we're able to place ourselves really into that whole thought process. So that's a wonderful gift and a great thing to share.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I wanted to write about the historical background of the Christmas stories is because, Christmas is a very magical time of the year, and over the centuries, we've accumulated an awful lot of magical fairy tale elements to the story. Flying reindeer and a fat elf who squeezes down your chimney on Christmas Eve with toys for the kiddies, and singing snowmen and various other things. And it's very easy, therefore, to look at the actual stories of our Lord's birth and also find in them some rather what seem to be magical elements. And over the centuries, they've been made into magical elements. Like a magical star that guides exotic wizards from the east across the desert sands, angels singing in the sky, the appearance of an angel to a young girl, kind of like the fairy godmother to Cinderella. I'm not mocking these things, and I believe in them, but I'm just saying it's easy in the popular imagination to treat those things on a similar level as we talk about, flying reindeer and elves, singing snowmen, and so forth and so on. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to dig back and actually strip away some of those seemingly magical elements to the story and get back to the history as Matthew and Luke tell it as best I could.
So I know we're here to talk about your this book about the shepherds, but you mentioned the stars guiding the Magi to the birth location. When you researched for that book in particular, was there something about that you found to be more plausible, or was that more of a like you just described, more of a fairy tale addition? The Christmas story, as we tell it, has the wise men following a magical star across the night sky to the Christ child of Bethlehem. But we know that stars don't actually move. Planets move across the sky, but stars don't. Mm-hmm. Furthermore, when I began to research the history of the Magi story from the Gospels on through time, it turns out that the story of the magical guiding star actually sort of finds its way into the received tradition from about the 5th or 6th century from Gnostic, extra-biblical Gnostic writings. Mm. And in a time before everybody had their own Bible and could read, these traditions sort of floated around and crept into the Christmas story bit by bit until they became part of the received tradition that we tell today. But a lot of those elements, not just the magical elements, but a lot of the elements aren't actually in the Christmas story. Another example is wise men riding camels across the desert sands. Now, they may have ridden camels, but there's no mention of the camels in Matthew's Gospel. That comes in from a different source. Wonderful, and we don't really know that there were 3, correct?
Exactly. It just says wise men or magi from the east. It doesn't give us the number. The number kept in, but because of the tradition of there being 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Mm-hmm. But in fact, in the early centuries of the church, there were from my research, about 6 or 7 different versions of the Magi story, in addition to St. Matthew's version. And all these different versions had numerous different numbers of the wise men, sometimes 3, sometimes 7, sometimes 12, and they all had different names depending where the extra tradition was coming from.
Wow.
Fascinating. Father Dwight Longenecker, our guest, and we're going to be talking about his new book, The Secret of the Bethlehem Shepherds, which is available from Sophia Institute and also from his website, dwightlongenecker.com. And as we look at these shepherds, maybe you can help unfold it a little bit. Who were these shepherds, and what's the significance to St. Luke in the nativity narrative?
Well, I can't tell you everything that's in the book in a short interview, but but to understand the shepherds in Bethlehem, we have to really understand the larger historical context of the Bedouin culture. The Bedouin culture is an umbrella term for all the different tribes of the ancient and contemporary Middle East, Western Arabia, Jordan, present-day Jordan, northern Egypt, Palestine. And the Bedouin are the wandering nomadic shepherds. And the Abrahamic tribes, the tribes descended from Abraham, are really all part of that larger category of the Bedouin. And the Bedouin were the shepherds that would have been in Bethlehem at the time. There are two different categories of the Bedouin, general categories, nomadic and semi-nomadic. The nomadic are always living in their tents, wandering from place to place to find pasturage for their flocks. The semi-nomadic are settled in towns and villages, but during certain parts of the year they're out with their flocks in a nomadic way. And the shepherds in Bethlehem would have been from that general Bedouin culture, but from the Hebrew tribe, if you like to think of the Bedouin culture, and semi-nomadic Bedouin shepherds there in Bethlehem, in the hills of Bethlehem.
So they would have been semi-nomadic because they want to remain tied to the Jewish culture. They're not going to travel off to some far-off land. They're going to stay relatively close to the community, if I understand you correctly.
Yes. In saying that the nomads were wandering, they weren't wandering great distances. They all stayed within a particular geographical area, not defined by any boundaries, but just by general sort of the locations of their pasturage and their flocks, and kind of loosely defined geographical territory. But the semi-nomadic would have settled in towns and villages because there were agricultural and family advantages to doing so. And so a particular tribe, like the tribe of Jesse, from which King David is descendant, would actually have settled in the Judean hills around the town of Bethlehem. And that's why it's called the City of David, because the tribe of Jesse, King David being the most prominent member, came from that particular area and were settled there in that semi-nomadic way.
That's fascinating. And how were they received, I guess, in society in general in Jesus' time? Just from a cultural standpoint, how did...
Yeah, that's a good question. In fact, the shepherds have a kind of double-edged reputation in the Hebrew culture. On the one hand, there's this venerable tradition of the shepherd. Father Abraham was a shepherd, Moses was a shepherd, King David was a shepherd. They were a shepherd people in a semi-nomadic and nomadic shepherd tribes. So there's this kind of venerable history of being a shepherd. In the Old Testament, the prophet Ezekiel says that God himself will come and be the shepherd of his people Israel. So there's this image of the good shepherd and a kind of romantic notion about the ancestry and the legacy of being shepherds. But on the other hand, in the contemporary culture in Jesus' time, the records show that the shepherds were considered to be a little bit low life. They didn't pay their taxes. They tended to have a reputation for being thieves and rustlers. From the viewpoint of the Jewish religion, they were unclean because they were dealing with animals with feces and blood and filth, and so they were unclean and could not go into the temple for worship. So, on the one hand, they were kind of low-life, working-class, disreputable farmers, and on the other hand, there's this venerable tradition of the within the Hebrew religion of the Good Shepherd.
Interesting. Now, I have to jump back to Ron's previous question, because I'm not sure that I understand or understood the link to specifically to St. Luke and his the significance of the nativity narrative. Was it culture related, or did we miss that?
No. Well, you have to remember there are two what they call infancy narratives, or two stories of Jesus' birth: St. Matthew's version and St. Luke's version. And St. Matthew's version and St. Luke's version are actually very different. They emphasize different aspects of the story, different characters of the story. But of course, we have conflated the two together in our typical retelling of the Christmas story. So the typical retelling of the Christmas story will have Joseph and Mary traveling to Bethlehem, and then on Christmas Eve night, baby Jesus is born in the stable. The shepherds see the angels, and they go and find baby Jesus, and what ho, they meet the wise men who are also there at the stable. In fact, Matthew's Gospel, which tells us about the wise men, have the wise men arriving probably a couple years later to Bethlehem, because he says that that Jesus by then is a young child.
Yeah.
The word could be translated toddler. So combining that with Herod killing all the young people, all the babies 2 years old and older, would give us the indication that the child Jesus by that time was probably a couple of years old.
Fascinating. Okay.
And so shepherds kind of looked down on, kind of as gypsies would be almost, but there were a lot of them, weren't there? I mean, shepherding seems like it would be like the number in the top 5 in terms of jobs that were available then. There are probably a lot of shepherds.
Well, certainly we're dealing with an agricultural society, and so yes, being shepherds would have been a major source of employment. But you asked about the significance of the Bethlehem Shepherds. Mm-hmm. A lot of scholars believe that actually the Bethlehem Shepherds were raising the sheep and the goats which would be sacrificed in the temple in Jerusalem. Remember, Jerusalem is just 6 miles away from Bethlehem, and the worship in the temple in Jerusalem consumed thousands of sheep every year. In fact, some of the numbers that the historian Josephus gives us for the Passover lamb, that there were tens of thousands of Passover lambs sacrificed on that particular day.
Wow.
We think that his numbers are a bit exaggerated, but even so, there was a consumption of thousands of sheep and lambs and goats in the temple worship in Jerusalem. Where do they all come from? Well, there's a detail in the Mishnah, which is a Hebrew collection of writings about the customs and traditions of the Hebrew religion, that say that the animals in the area between Jerusalem and Bethlehem are dedicated to the temple worship. So some scholars believe, and I tend to agree with them, that the Bethlehem shepherds were a special kind of shepherd, that they were actually raising the sheep and the goats and the livestock to be sacrificed at the temple in Jerusalem.
And perhaps raising them differently because they were intended for sacrifice, correct?
Yes, in fact, there is a beautiful story or idea that the sacred shepherds in Bethlehem were raising the lambs for the Passover, and that when the lamb would be born, they would wrap it in strips of cloth and lay it in a manger, waiting for the priest to come and examine the lamb to make sure it was worthy to be a Passover lamb. So when the angel said to the shepherds, "You shall find the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes and laying in a manger, and this shall be a sign to you," that it was a sign that they were going to see the real Passover lamb.
Oh, I see the connection, yes.
Yeah, the only problem with this is that's one of the reasons I went to Bethlehem and Jerusalem to research the story. I wanted to see if there was any historical background for this. And I'm afraid to say I did not find any scrap of evidence for that to be true. I spoke to shepherds, present-day shepherds. I did research on the customs of the times. I did all the research with all the documents I could find. I spoke to scholars at the Hebrew University. And this seems to be a rather charming and delightful story that may be developed through the traditions of preaching, but there doesn't seem to be any historical evidence for it as such.
Maybe somebody trying to find a connection, and the history was distorted in a way to get that to fit.
Yes, and this is one of the things which I bring out in the book, how historical events can actually be distorted very often through good intentions, but also through an accumulation of tradition. I'll give you another example. Mm-hmm. The ox and the ass in the stable at Bethlehem, the oxen and the donkey. In fact, Matthew and Luke don't mention any donkey or any oxen being there. So we ask ourselves, well, where did this come into the story from? And then we find that in the prophet Isaiah, chapter 1, there is a prophecy which says, the ox and the ass know their manger, know their crib, but they do not know their master. In other words, there's a reference back in Isaiah about a manger and an ox and a donkey, and the preachers down through the ages picked up on that and said, oh, that must be referring to the stable in Bethlehem. And so therefore, the ox and the donkey find their way into the story of the stable in Bethlehem.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you bring this up because you look at any typical nativity scene and you see these animals along with the wise men, along with the, and of course you just recently just mentioned here just a few minutes ago that you discovered that it wasn't plausible that the wise men were there, but you have the ox, you have the ass, you have the manger, you have the wise men, and that's what you typically see in these nativity scenes that are placed all over everywhere these days.
Yes, and I don't mean to dismantle the lovely traditions that we appreciate. Mm-hmm. People can still have camels in their crib set if they want to.
Yeah.
I'm not legislating on this, but I am just trying to point out in my books what was the real historical background and what really happened, the best we can know it, so that people most of all realize that this was not a fairy tale. It was not just a fanciful story that was made up to make Jesus seem better, but this is real historical events grounded in real people in a real place in a real time.
So I have to ask, no one's referred to you as a Grinch for attempting to dismantle these stories.
I'm not being a Grinch or a Scrooge, trying to say none of this happened.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm trying to prove the opposite, that it actually did happen, but it was real and historical, but the historical facts are a bit different than we actually tell at Christmas time.
Sure, yeah. So, are there anything else that you learned from the circumstances surrounding the birth of Christ? From your time that you spent there in Israel on your sabbatical.
Oh yeah, lots of things. So, for instance, I was talking to some of the kids in our parish school today, and saying, "How did Mary get from Nazareth to Bethlehem?" And all their hands shot up and said, "She rode a little donkey." And I said, "Well, she probably did, and that was a common form of transportation at the day, and it would make sense that she did, but in fact, Matthew and Luke don't tell us that she rode on a donkey at all. Instead, that creeps into the story from a 2nd century document called the Proto-Evangelium of James, and in that retelling of the Christmas story, Mary is riding a donkey. But it doesn't come into Matthew and Luke."
That's interesting.
So if if you said there's lots of examples, let's go with another one here, and I can formulate my question better.
Yeah, another one would be the grumpy innkeeper.
Oh yeah,
yes.
Okay, who appears in all the best Christmas plays.
Yeah, no vacancies.
Okay, the word inn. Well, first of all, Bethlehem was a very small village, and we know from the historians that inns and taverns and hotels and so forth were very uncommon in the ancient world, and they were only for very rich people who were traveling on the Roman roads. There were some low dives and taverns, but they were disreputable places, and there was not likely to be one in Bethlehem. So we have to ask ourselves, where did Joseph and Mary actually seek accommodation when they arrived in Bethlehem? Well, the people of the Middle East have a wonderful tradition of hospitality, and if Bethlehem was Joseph's hometown, he would most certainly have knocked on the door of one of his relatives, trying to find some shelter. The word which is translated in the New Testament, especially coming to us from the King James Version, is best translated guest chamber or guest room. And we know that the houses of the 1st century Judea were very often 1 or 2 room houses with a special guest room on the roof. And they were very often, there was lots of caves in that area, and these houses were very often built in front of natural caves in the hillside. And so the best translation is that Joseph and Mary arrived in Bethlehem, and there was no room for them in the guest room, and therefore their relative invited Mary to give birth in the stable, which would have been the cave, which was behind the house where they were dwelling. Now, this detail also matches up with a couple of other things. It matches up with the story in the Proto-Evangelium of James and in the writings of Justin Martyr and St. Origen that Jesus was born in a cave, and therefore, if we ask ourselves, was Jesus born in a stable or a cave, we can say that he was born in a stable that was being used he was born in a cave that was being used as a stable. And the inn, if there was no inn, there was no grumpy innkeeper. Instead, there was no room in the guest house or the guest room of his relative's home. So he went to the cave, which was behind the home. And the idea of Jesus being born in a drafty, cold barn, well, actually, he was probably born in a warm, dry cave, which was really serving as a kind of storage room or stabling room behind an ordinary house there in Bethlehem.
Fascinating. Now, I guess the you've mentioned this a couple times, the Proto-Evangelium of James, and I know this is not a book of the Bible, and there's a reason for that. How well are these documents used for accurate research? I mean, can we rely on them?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because these extra biblical writings, they were being composed right down through to the 5th and 6th century and later by various writers who were elaborating on the Christmas story. The Proto-Evangelium of James, however, is much earlier than the others. It dates from the early 2nd century, or even maybe the end of the 1st century. So within about 100 years of Jesus' death, and just about 100 years after the events in Bethlehem. And scholars believe that it originates from the Jerusalem church. And we know that Mary and Jesus' extended family were members of the Jerusalem church in the early days, and therefore it's very likely that some of the details, at least, in the Proto-Evangelium of James are rooted in the historical account.
Father Dwight Longenecker is our guest here on Faith with Reasons. He is always brought up in an evangelical home in Pennsylvania and in an Anglican church and Anglican trained, but he and his family became Catholic in 1995. He serves now as the pastor of Our Lady of the Rosary Church in Greenville, South Carolina. And, the books, you have a couple of them that I think are perfect for Advent. The one we're talking about today, the new one, The Secret of the Bethlehem Shepherds, and your previous book, Mystery of the Magi. I think these are perfect reads for Advent and, of course, for Christmas as well. And I know on your website you pair these together. There's kind of an Advent special going on right now that makes it real accessible. So thank you for that. And it had to be a real joy to write these. And of course they're not big books. They're not big heavy tomes. That's why I say it's really a perfect Advent read too.
Yeah, I write in an accessible style, so these books will be appropriate for even middle school and up. I've been reading them and enjoying them and learning about the true Christmas story. And
you know what? I just heard the music come on, Father. That means we're heading into break. I wanted to ask you. You mentioned we talked a bit about Bethlehem and why it was such a special place. But when we come back from the break, maybe you can set the scene for us on this journey. And then the eventual nativity of our Lord, and maybe what Mary and Joseph had to go through, and so forth. So we'll take this little break, and we'll come back on the other side. Faith with Reasons with Father Dwight Longenecker.
Carry the home missions close to your heart by downloading the free Glen Mary Home Missioners mobile app. Glen Mary brings the Catholic faith to rural parts of Appalachia and the South where it is not effectively present. The free Glen Mary app is a one-stop shop to access daily reflections written by missioners, prayer resources, and information about mission in the United States. The app is available for iPhones and Androids. To download, search Glen Mary in your mobile device's app store or visit glenmary.org/app. That's glenmary.org/app.
Jesus Christ established one church with one set of beliefs, as stated in Ephesians 4, verse 5. He did not establish numerous churches with contradictory beliefs. To see which is the true church, we must look for the one that has an unbroken historical link to the church of the New Testament. John Henry Newman, in his 1844 book, An Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine, traced Catholic beliefs backwards century by century to the New Testament times. He discovered a real continuity of beliefs, that the Catholic Church existed from day one of church history, that it is in fact the church established by Christ. Newman was not a Catholic when he started the book, but his research convinced him of the truth of the Catholic faith, and as the book was finished, he converted. Examining the truths of the Catholic faith, this is faithforensics.org.
This is Father Philip Smith, Director of Vocations for the Diocese of Toledo, and I would invite you to join me in praying a prayer for priestly vocations. Lord God, in your plan for our salvation, you provide shepherds for your people. Fill the hearts of young people in the Diocese of Toledo with courage and love. Raise up worthy ministers for your altars. Make them ardent yet gentle servants of the gospel. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Now, back to Faith with Reasons here on Annunciation Radio.
Hey, welcome back here. Shayne Stanfield with Ron Finn, and we're really blessed to have Father Dwight Longenecker once again on our program, this time to discuss the secret of the Bethlehem Shepherds, his latest book, I believe, out from Sophia Institute. And in case you don't know, Father Longenecker was brought up as an evangelical, studied at fundamental Bob Jones University, and later was ordained as an Anglican priest in England. And after 10 years of ministry in the Anglican Church as a curate, chaplain at Cambridge, and as a country parson, or country parson, in 1995, Father Dwight was received into full communion with the Catholic Church. And if I remember the story correctly, you and a number of other priests at the time were converting to Catholicism. Just so you know, Father Dwight has published in numerous magazines, religious magazines and papers in the UK, Ireland, and the United States. He's writing on film and theology, apologetics, biblical commentary, and Catholic culture. And again, we're here to talk about the secret of the Bethlehem Shepherds. And as just before we were going into break, we were going to get into the significance of Bethlehem, and maybe having Father Dwight set the stage for us for the journey of Mary and Joseph and the nativity scene.
Yes, I'd like to remind listeners also that you were talking about my conversion story. That my conversion story has also just been published. It's called There and Back Again.
Yes,
and it's available on my website and also from Ignatius Press. But to talk about Bethlehem.
And let me stop you right there, Father, because when you were on last time, we got into that book in pretty good detail. So if people want to go back to the on demand the podcast on our website on artoledo.com, you can look for his name, because all of them have the names on them, and you can listen. You can kind of re-listen to that episode. So go ahead.
I do apologize for not remembering that we'd actually spoken about that book here on this same broadcast, but I do talk to a lot of
people. Well, I mean, you've written over 20 books here, so
Yeah.
And I was just going to add, too, we must have treated you fairly kind because you agreed to come back, so that's good for us.
Yeah, good. To get back to Bethlehem, Bethlehem, of course, as I said before, is the city of David, where the King David grew up there, and his family home was there. And so it has this great history within the Hebrew sort of tradition. And our Lord, of course, is the son of David. He's a descendant of King David and the tribe of Jesse. So Bethlehem, therefore, is also his hometown, because it was his adoptive father, Joseph's hometown, who was from the same clan of Jesse and David. So Bethlehem is important in that respect. But there's another wonderful detail about the name Bethlehem. In Hebrew, Bethlehem actually means house of bread. And so the bread of life is born in a town called the House of Bread.
Wow.
But the other really intriguing sort of linguistic coincidence is that in Aramaic and Arabic, the other language which is spoken out there, Bethlehem actually means house of flesh. So there in Bethlehem, he who would be the bread of life and give his flesh for the life of the world is born. So it's the house of flesh and the house of bread at the same time.
Wonderful. No, it did not know that, and that's a very interesting fact. So are we ready to move on to this journey of Mary and Joseph to find a place to give birth?
Yes, one of the things which I pondered when I was reading St. Luke's account is this detail that Mary is in Nazareth when the angel Gabriel appears to her, and then she makes this journey to visit her kinswoman Elizabeth. And tradition has it that Elizabeth and Zechariah lived in the town of Ein Karim, which is about 6 miles south of Jerusalem, just in the same distance as Bethlehem is, but in a different direction. And but Nazareth is 90 miles to the north. And so we have the prospect of this young woman newly pregnant. And when I say young woman, she may even have been as young as 13 or 14 years old, making a journey seemingly by herself to go 90 miles to visit her kinswoman. And I'm scratching my head and saying, is this actually plausible or not? And I came across a very interesting book in my research, a German scholar, who was researching different documents that were found in Egypt, written on papyrus, and they did not disintegrate because of the dry weather in Egypt. Mm-hmm. And these are ordinary documents, business receipts, personal letters, business records, things like that. And she pieces together from these little bits of evidence what life was like in 2,000 years ago in the Middle East. And one of the details she brought forward, she found and published, was that women would very often travel long distances on their own in order to be with a family member who was having a baby. And that's exactly what happens in the story of the Visitation. The Blessed Virgin Mary travels to be with her kinswoman who's having a baby. The other detail, which a lot of people overlook, is that St. Luke tells us that St. Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, was 6 months into her pregnancy when this happened, and that the Blessed Virgin Mary stayed with her for 3 months. In other words, the Blessed Virgin Mary traveled to see her kinswoman, not just to share the joy of her own pregnancy, but to also be there for the birth of John the Baptist.
So, yeah, I've always really been awed by her humility. You know, she could be so consumed with her own situation. Instead, her first impulse is to go and offer charity to a kinswoman.
I also took some time to speculate about the relationship between the Blessed Virgin Mary and St. Elizabeth. St. Luke simply tells us that St. Elizabeth was her kinswoman. Now, we know from the linguistics of the Bible that the Greek language and the Hebrew language don't have all the different words that we have for different relatives. We have specific names for aunt, uncle, cousin, first cousin, stepbrother, stepsister, stepmother, stepfather, so forth and so on. Mm-hmm. They didn't have all those words. They simply used kinswoman or kinsman. So I was asking myself, what was the actual relationship between the Blessed Virgin Mary and St. Elizabeth and St. Zechariah, her husband, the parents of John the Baptist? And the ancient traditions have it that actually Mary was born in Jerusalem, and that was her home. And if you visit the Church of St. Anne in Jerusalem today, and remember St. Anne is the Blessed Virgin's mother, you can visit the house of the Blessed Virgin, as it's called, or the house of St. Anne. And these are built on the locations where tradition says the Blessed Virgin Mary was born and brought up as a young girl. So we ask ourselves, if she was in Jerusalem, brought up in Jerusalem, and Joseph's hometown is Bethlehem, they're both close to Jerusalem, and the other ancient tradition is that the Blessed Virgin Mary was orphaned at a young age, that St. Anne and St. Joachim both passed away. So what happened to the girl Mary? Perhaps she was adopted by her kinswoman, Elizabeth, and her husband, Zechariah, who were childless and would have had a good motivation to adopt a child. And so perhaps when she goes to visit Elizabeth, she's actually visiting sort of her adoptive aunt or adoptive sort of stepmother. So this was speculation on my part, but I was trying to put together some of the pieces of the early tradition that we have, and wondering how could all these things have been fit together. So,
if we go back to this trip that she would have made to visit, you've pretty much confirmed that she would have done that alone. So she's going to make a journey of 90 miles by herself.
Well, the other detail which came from this research that I told you about is that the women, when they were traveling in the ancient world, would travel in caravans of other people. Maybe there were a group of tradesmen who were traveling from city to city, or a group of pilgrims who were traveling to the holy city. And we know that, of course, from the story in Luke's Gospel about Jesus, Mary, and Joseph going up to Jerusalem for the story of the finding of the temple. When Jesus is 12 years old, it says that they went to ask where Jesus was amongst the others who were in the caravan. So that we know that these caravans were traveling, groups of people traveling together for safety between Galilee and Judea, between Nazareth and Jerusalem. And so it fits in with all the historical details that we know, that the Blessed Virgin Mary, even if she was 13 or 14, could very easily have joined one of these caravans and traveled in safety with some of her friends or some of her kinspeople who were also making the regular trip from Nazareth up to Jerusalem.
But just making reference that she was doing it alone. She wasn't going with necessarily family of hers, but she would have gone with acquaintances, or as you said, it was common for people just to group together for safety reasons.
Yeah, and we know that there were regular caravans or pilgrimage groups going from Galilee up to Jerusalem. And remember, Bethlehem and Cain, where Elizabeth is living, are just a short distance from Jerusalem. So she could very easily have jumped on the bus, if you like, with some of those groups of people who were already traveling there.
Now you bring up safety. This is this is a major concern. I mean, there were people that were out there that were doing nothing but to pillage these groups. So they were better off traveling in numbers. It was it was a dangerous thing to do.
Yeah, and there's some fascinating travel diaries and travel logs of people from only a slightly later time than this, in the 5th and 6th centuries, travel logs of traveling out in the ancient Middle East. And yes, it was very typical for people to join into trade caravans and business caravans, and other groups of people were also traveling across the wilderness to these different cities because there were bandits and robbers along the way. And we know we hear about the bandits and the robbers, remember, in the story of the Good Samaritan.
Yes, yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Now, getting back to some of these shepherds, the Bethlehem Shepherds, they were really the first ones to arrive on the scene, were they not? Didn't they beat the wise men there to be there to adore the newborn Christ?
Yeah, they were, and one of the things I pointed out about their importance was because we learned from the shepherds how the stories were actually related. St. Luke actually says that the shepherds told everybody about this wonderful thing that had happened. And therefore, the shepherds are the first witnesses, and their witness actually is passed down to their descendants and down into the traditions there in Bethlehem and in the Jerusalem area. We can assume that 30 years later, when Jesus appears on the scene and he's baptized in the River Jordan and begins his ministry, that the people in Bethlehem would have said, "Oh, yes, we remember him. We remember his birth. It took place here in our town. We remember when the angels appeared to the shepherds on the hillside. We remember when those strange travelers arrived here from Jerusalem, from the eastern cities to actually worship him. And this is the same guy. He is the Messiah." So they would have remembered that, and they would have been the first Christians.
That's interesting. And now, in reading St. Luke, for example, it's very descriptive. It talks about the manger and the swaddling clothes being a sign to these shepherds. Why is that? Why is that detail there?
Well, I wondered about this for some time because when I did not find the evidence of that other story I told you about, that they were going to see the Passover lamb, who would also be wrapped in swaddling clothes and laying in a manger, I thought, well, what was the significance then? Why did they say this would be a sign to them? And I think it was a sign to them. And scholars have picked through various verses in the Old Testament which talk about swaddling clothes and so forth, but they're pretty far-fetched. I'm not sure that they were actually a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies, unless there were some other prophecies we don't know about, which were in the oral tradition and just in the background and the history of Bethlehem that we don't know about. But the reasoning I put together was that Jesus was actually born and wrapped in swaddling clothes, which was a very typical way for babies to be dealt with after their birth. When I was in Bethlehem, I asked some of the shepherds there, people who are still living there, did you ever hear of wrapping the lambs up in swaddling clothes? And the shepherd laughed and said, "No, but that's what we do with our babies."
Oh,
okay. So in other words, I think that the angels were saying to the shepherds, the sign is that this Christ child, the son of David, the Messiah, is going to be born in a very ordinary home, like one of the ones you live in a very ordinary way, laying in a manger and being wrapped in swaddling clothes, just like you would do with one of your babies. Therefore, he's one of you. He's come to be born, the Word made flesh among us. And that they would understand, that was the sign, that they understood that he was actually one of them.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense, and it really points to the humility of the nativity story. I mean, there was no great triumph, when Jesus was born, and that is something that really kind of hits home for us Catholics. We kind of learn our humility from the nativity narrative.
Yes.
So, when you look at the story, the story of the nativity, and again, we touched on this in the first half. A lot of stuff has been exaggerated in some ways. The star guiding, the Magi, and is there? It seems very mystical, very very strange, and of course we know God works in strange ways. So the birth of Jesus is a great example of this. Let's discuss this for a moment.
The mystical aspect of the wise men is sometimes exaggerated. St. Matthew is telling the story of the wise men, never actually says that a magical star guided them across the desert sands. As I said in the first half, that came into the story from about the 5th or 6th century from extra-biblical writings. Instead, most scholars believe that the wise men were astrologers and that they saw certain signs in the night sky, according to their astrological method, to indicate that a new king of the Jews would be born. And that's what prompted them to go on their journey to actually find this new king of the Jews. So they read the stars and the signs in the heavens according to their astrological theories, and they drew the conclusion that there was a new king of the Jews. And that's why they went to see Herod, first of all, because they knew Herod was the king of the so-called king of the Jews, and they went to him and basically said, have you got a new son or a new grandson? We've come to pay him homage. And of course Herod says, I don't know about this. What are you talking about?
Mm-hmm.
And that's when he gets a bit jealous.
But we have been able to determine to some extent that there had to have been some sort of an astronomical event. I mean, that was the most plausible thing that they were observing, not something that necessarily would repeat itself, or would it? Based on your research?
We're talking about particular configurations of the constellations, which astrologers like to use to prognosticate and predict the future.
Mm-hmm.
And the evidence would indicate that these magi were actually astrologers, and they were studying the different constellations and movements of the planets, and they were therefore drawing the conclusion that there was a new king of the Jews. Now, what this actually was specifically is debated amongst the different scholars, because there's actually lots of different planets, lots of different stars, lots of different constellations, and there's a good bit of disagreement about what those signs actually were. But the general agreement is that they were studying the constellations, and the particular planets were moving within those constellations in order to produce the conclusions that there was a new king of the Jews who would be born.
Interesting. Again, the book is called The Secret of the Bethlehem Shepherds, and it's Father Dwight Longenecker, and you can visit his website, dwightlongenecker.com, and learn all about him, but also learn about all the books that are available, including the two that deal with Christmas themes. And this particular book, as well as the other Christmas book, The Mystery of the Magi, there's an Advent special going right now, which is always nice to have. And it's fascinating when you start to place yourself at the scene, so to speak, as you did on your sabbatical and in your research and so forth, that really we learn a lot about the nativity of our Lord. It really makes it, God kind of makes this accessible to us, but we tend to complicate things. As you mentioned, different stories emerge after even centuries that weren't part of the original story, but we do tend to fall into that trap of either adding more or changing the narrative a little bit, enhancing it, so to speak. You were able to unscramble.
And I discuss in the beginning of the book how these things come about. Some of them come about through legend, some simply by mistaking details and passing the mistaken details on. Others come in through additional retellings of the story where new details are added. Others come from preaching points where we actually draw certain preaching points from the story, and then that preaching point actually becomes part of the greater tradition. One of these, for instance, is that Mary and Joseph were homeless on Christmas Eve, and that therefore they are poor, homeless people. Well, actually, it's not likely that they were homeless. They were probably staying in the home of one of Joseph's relatives, and the idea that Jesus is born in a cold, drafty stable, shivering on the winter night, he was actually probably born in a warm, dry cave that was used as a storage place behind a very a relatively comfortable home.
So, obviously we're in in the midst of Advent. We're preparing for the second coming of the Lord, but there's a lot of the nativity are reflecting on nativity in advance, if you would. There's a lot that it can teach us today. I mean, what can we benefit out of reflecting upon the birth of the Christ now during Advent for his second coming?
Yeah, there's a great tendency in the church today and in the world today to dismiss the Christmas stories, as I said earlier on, as just a bunch of fairy tales and not really having any substance. But we need to go back and reassert that actually these are real events in real human history, and they took place at a particular place at a particular time because the incarnation of our Lord Jesus Christ is the most important fact in human history. And if we just relegate the whole thing to fairy tale, then before long, all the other stories in the Gospel and the Bible, soon we start, maybe not consciously, but we have in the sort of background, well, it's not really true, it didn't really happen. And we need to affirm and assert, yes, it did happen, it was historical, because our salvation is also historical. So while we enjoy all the beautiful traditions of Christmas and all the finery and the decorations and the presents and all the feasting and the fun, we have to also go back in our Christmas masses, in our Christmas services, and be reassured and reaffirm the reality of our Lord's incarnation.
Well, we're certainly thankful to the Bethlehem Shepherds for kind of teaching us how to adore and really how to fall on our knees. They're a good example for us today, and this book it kind of introduces us to these Bethlehem Shepherds and unlocks some of those secrets. So it's not a large book, but it's packed with some terrific information, great reflections on not only the Nativity but on these Bethlehem Shepherds.
Good. Well, thanks for the opportunity to talk about it this afternoon.
Is there anything that you're currently working on now, or something that's in the pipeline that you're anticipating to begin work on soon?
I'm trying to work on a book about sacrifice and what it actually means for the modern world, but it's taken me a good bit of time to do all the research and the background reading on it.
Fascinating. And sacrifice in the modern world, that's more of, let's touch on that just briefly. I mean, that's...
in other words, what did sacrifice mean in the ancient world, and why do we, especially in the Catholic Church, still talk about sacrifice when we're actually celebrating Mass?
Wonderful.
And for a lot of modern people, this is a mystery. They want to say, we don't do that anymore. We don't cut the throats of animals and sprinkle their blood all over the place. So why are you still talking about sacrifice like this?
Yeah,
and I'm going to try to, if I can, to explain what it means for modern people and why it's still important.
That'd be wonderful. Yeah, I can't wait for that one.
Yeah. And you did touch on what was done in the ancient world previously. You said there were estimates that there could have been tens of thousands of. That was the reason for these shepherds. Tens of thousands of sheep would have been slaughtered for sacrificial reasons.
Yes. And also in so many ancient civilizations, it wasn't just animal sacrifice, but it was also human sacrifice. And I want to explore the horrors of that and what it meant to people back then and what it actually might mean to us today when we still read about these things.
Oh yeah. In speaking of the animals, just a curiosity of my own, what was done with the animals after they were sacrificed? I mean, they were put to death, but was the meat used in some way? Was it given to the poor? How was the animal treated after the fact? Were they burned?
Yeah, it's complicated. There were various different kinds of sacrifice. The whole sacrifice would be the whole carcass of the animal would have been incinerated. But there were other sacrifices where the animal was actually slaughtered and butchered, and the meat was given to the priests, and the priests actually had to consume it with their families. So, there was different types of sacrifice in the Jewish temple, in the Hebrew temple in Jerusalem, and all the different forms of sacrifice had different meaning. So, sometimes it was butchered and consumed. Other times it was incinerated and just turned into and burnt completely.
So we read of this in the Passover. I mean, and that was a sacrificial ritual for the preservation of a specific lamb, and then the preparation of it being used for the preparation of the Passover meal.
For the Passover meal, the lambs would have been taken home and would have been consumed by the family. That was part of the Passover ritual.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And Father Dwight Longenecker, where can people find you and all your books, and of course this book, The Secret of the Bethlehem Shepherds?
I'm happy to welcome them over to my website, dwightlongenecker.com, where I blog most days. And there's other content, video content, audio content, and my bookstore, so they can browse my books. So I'm always happy to have more readers over there, and they can just come and join there, and they can subscribe if they wish to support my work, or they can simply come and read and participate and enjoy the free content that's there.
Wonderful, Father. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your wonderful work. Father Dwight Longenecker, our guest today on Faith with Reasons. Can't wait to have you back on, perhaps when you finish the next book. Can't wait to read about that.
Okay, well, thanks for the invitation. God bless you and all your listeners. Yep.
Thank you very much. Next week, Father James Kubicki will be joining us here on Faith with Reasons. Thanks for listening.